It's terrible that after 50 years, it is behind closed doors. And I've no intention that I've started to stop now. I'm determined to put an end to this. Terrible.
The room at Balmoral had been designed for quiet decisions, not emotional explosions. Yet during one private winter council, a revelation concerning Queen Camilla reportedly changed the mood so sharply that even seasoned royal advisors stopped speaking. Charles remained motionless. William watched carefully. And Camilla, seated only a few feet away, suddenly realized that the discussion was no longer about routine palace business. It was about her position inside the monarchy itself. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles knew the gathering had crossed into dangerous ground. The dramatized Balmoral Winter Council brought together the king, his wife, William, relatives and advisors to discuss responsibilities, family authority, and the monarchy's direction. A council here simply meant a closed strategy meeting, not a public constitutional body. That mattered because the issue concerned influence rather than Camilla's formal title. A senior advisor reached the recommendation reportedly months in preparation. The confidential internal review argued that Camilla's informal role in sensitive family decisions should be reduced, with future matters routed directly through Charles and William instead of passing through her household staff. When the reading ended, the advisor placed the folder flat before them. Camilla looked at Charles for reassurance. He kept his attention on the papers. Camilla felt the meaning immediately. This was not a crown being removed or a title being stripped away. It was subtler and perhaps more painful. Years of relationships, private access, and carefully built influence could be weakened without a public announcement. Charles still said nothing, and that silence forced her to consider whether the king had already accepted a change he could not bring himself to explain. William carried a different burden. The prince understood why supporters of the review believed clearer lines of authority would protect the monarchy's future, especially as more responsibility moved toward him. Yet he also knew agreement could deepen tension with his father's wife. According to the leaked account, however, the proposal had not originated with Charles. Someone had pushed for the review long before Balmoral, allowing pressure to build quietly for months. Camilla finally asked whether the decision had already been made. No one rushed to answer. Charles remained still, while William's expression gave away almost nothing. But the Queen heard what the silence seemed to say. This conversation was not the beginning of the process. It might have been the moment she was finally being told about one already moving without her. And when Camilla finally turned toward William, the expression on his face made one thing painfully clear: the Balmoral revelation had not appeared from nowhere. Behind every palace decision are people forced to live with its consequences, and inside that Balmoral room, 3 lives were suddenly colliding. Camilla saw years of hard-won acceptance being tested. Charles faced a choice between protecting his wife and preserving royal stability. William carried the burden of a future crown that demanded discipline over sentiment. None of them could leave that table unchanged, because this was no longer about protocol. It had become personal. Charles felt the pressure more deeply than anyone around him could easily measure. For years, the king had defended Camilla's place beside him through criticism, public suspicion, and painful memories that never fully disappeared. Restricting her private influence, therefore, carried a meaning beyond administration. It risked sounding like a judgment on decisions he himself had defended. Yet William's concern was equally difficult to dismiss. As heir, the prince believed the monarchy's next generation could not rely on informal influence passing quietly between separate royal households. In this context, royal households simply meant the private teams supporting individual senior royals. Competing channels could create confusion over who actually carried responsibility. Charles eventually moved away from the table and stood with William during the pause. The king asked quietly whether his son truly believed the recommendation was necessary. William did not answer immediately. He knew his response could wound someone his father had spent decades protecting. Finally, the future king said the institution could not depend on informal channels forever. His words were calm, but Charles heard the warning beneath them. A future monarch needed clear authority, and blurred loyalties could become dangerous when serious family matters collided with official responsibility. Camilla understood that warning differently. The queen consort had expected disagreements with William, perhaps even sharp ones, but she had not expected him to support a structure that would place her further outside sensitive discussions. To her, his position felt less like reform and more like calculated distance. Charles could see that hurt immediately. He wanted to reassure his wife, yet he also understood why his son believed stronger boundaries were necessary. Affection pulled him toward her. Duty pulled him toward William. For once, neither side could receive the comfort it wanted. Camilla's unease deepened when a palace aide spoke to her privately after the pause. According to the dramatized account, the aide explained that the review had begun after several senior courtiers complained about important discussions moving through competing household channels. Courtiers, in plain terms, were senior palace staff responsible for helping manage royal business and private coordination. Then came the detail that changed everything again. William had been consulted during the review process, even though he had not written the recommendation himself. Camilla immediately began asking when those consultations had started. Charles sensed where her questions were heading, and William knew the answer could reopen tensions everyone had tried to contain. What emerged pointed not to Balmoral, but to one royal gathering months earlier, when a disagreement over authority had apparently convinced senior figures that something had to change. The deeper she searched for the beginning, the clearer it became that Balmoral was only where the truth surfaced. The real rupture had happened long before winter. Every royal crisis has a moment that seems insignificant when it happens, only to become enormous later. For this one, the turning point was not a council, a ceremony, or a public confrontation. It was a private family dinner months before Balmoral, when a discussion about royal duties crossed an invisible line. Words were exchanged. William went quiet. Camilla refused to retreat, and by the time the evening ended, one conversation had created consequences nobody at the table yet understood. William had already been growing uneasy. Separate royal households were struggling with overlapping invitations, charitable commitments, private requests, and access to Charles, leaving advisors unsure which conversations carried real authority. In simple terms, a royal household is the team that supports a senior royal's official and private work. The prince believed too many decisions were taking shape through informal discussions before formal briefings ever reached him. Camilla saw the same system differently. She believed trusted personal relationships helped the king absorb family pressure before it reached a breaking point. Camilla finally pushed that belief too far at a private Windsor dinner. The queen consort suggested that one sensitive family matter should first be handled through Charles's household before William became involved. She believed the approach would protect the monarch from unnecessary tension. William immediately disagreed. Anything affecting the future monarchy, he said, had to include the heir from the beginning. For the prince, the heir simply meant the person first in line to become the next monarch, carrying responsibility for continuity long before the crown actually passed. Charles felt the mood change instantly. The king set down his glass and told them both to stop. Camilla folded her hands and insisted she was trying to protect him from pressure, not undermine his son. William answered quietly, but his words landed harder than anger. Excluding the heir did not remove pressure. It only delayed the moment when that pressure became impossible to manage. Charles understood both arguments, yet his silence left neither of them satisfied. Camilla left the dinner convinced something deeper had shifted. She felt William was no longer questioning one decision. He was questioning her judgment, her loyalty, and the place she believed she had earned beside Charles. The queen feared he wanted her reduced to a ceremonial presence, rather than an influential partner. William, however, felt no triumph. He worried that a future transition could turn chaotic if nobody knew where private influence ended and institutional responsibility began. William did not know how quickly that argument would spread beyond the dinner table. According to the dramatized internal account, within 48 hours a senior palace official began compiling examples of overlapping private decision-making. Those notes eventually formed the foundation of the review presented at Balmoral months later. Camilla understood the sequence at last. The dinner had not merely caused hurt feelings, it had triggered an investigation. And once she realized that, there was only one person she wanted to confront face to face. And when the next private meeting began, Camilla did not ask advisors to explain themselves, she looked directly at William. The confrontation everyone had avoided finally came without warning. No press officers, no senior courtiers, no ceremonial smiles. Camilla entered the room carrying months of frustration, while William knew immediately why she had come. What followed was not a shouting match, but something far more dangerous inside royal life, a calm conversation in which neither person was willing to pretend the conflict did not exist. For the first time, both said what they believed the other had been doing. Camilla did not waste time. The Queen Consort asked William whether he had actively wanted her influence reduced after discovering his involvement in the internal review. For her, that review was no longer just a palace process. It was an institutional examination, meaning a formal internal effort to decide how authority and responsibility should be organized. William answered carefully. The prince said he had supported clearer lines of responsibility, but insisted the process had never been designed as a personal attack against her. Camilla pushed harder. She asked him directly, "Do you believe I interfere?" William held her gaze before answering. He believed, he said, that too many important decisions depended on private relationships rather than defined responsibility. The words were controlled, yet they struck deeply. Camilla heard more than criticism of procedure. She heard years of supporting Charles being recast as influence that had somehow gone too far. William felt the conversation tightening around them. The future king tried to explain that the issue was not whether Camilla cared about Charles, because he knew she did. His concern was what happened when private loyalty began shaping matters that would later affect the monarchy's next generation. Camilla responded that he had never fully trusted her. That accusation finally cracked his composure. He did not deny everything. Instead, he admitted that trust inside the family had always been complicated, and pretending otherwise would solve nothing. Camilla then revealed why she had really demanded the meeting. According to the dramatized account, she had learned through a private conversation with a palace aide that William discussed his concerns with senior advisors after the Windsor dinner. She accused him of helping turn one disagreement into a formal review. William did not retreat. He acknowledged raising concerns, but insisted he had never ordered an investigation or written its conclusions. William then delivered the detail she had not expected. Charles, he said, had later authorized the review to continue after advisors presented their concerns. The king's authorization meant the process had moved forward with his approval, not simply because his son had questioned the system. Camilla went silent. For months, she had treated William as the force pushing her away from the center. Now the possibility facing her was far more painful. Camilla left with anger still burning, but its direction had changed. William had played a role, yet he had not possessed the final authority. She had entered the room prepared to blame the heir, but she walked out, knowing the final authority had always rested with her husband. Charles had spent much of his life balancing personal conviction against royal expectation, but Balmoral placed those two instincts directly against one another. Supporting Camilla emotionally was easy. Protecting every informal influence surrounding her was not. The king now faced a decision that no advisor could make for him. If he rejected the review, he risked reopening concerns about palace structure. If he accepted it, he would personally deliver a blow to the woman who had stood beside him through decades of scrutiny. Charles understood exactly where the final responsibility rested. As monarch, the king held decisive authority over how his private household coordinated with William and other senior royals. A royal household, in this case, meant the staff and offices that manage a senior royal's official work, private schedule, and internal communication. The recommendation did not remove Camilla's title or public duties. Instead, it narrowed informal channels so sensitive family decisions would move through clearly designated offices rather than personal networks. Charles read the final summary alone. The monarch reached the last page, removed his glasses, and set them beside the folder, while an aide waited quietly near the door. For several moments, he said nothing. The language on the page was administrative, almost clinical, but he knew Camilla would not experience it that way. To her, every new boundary would feel like a judgment on years spent standing beside him through public criticism and private strain. William's argument also refused to disappear. The prince believed a monarchy preparing for succession could not operate through overlapping circles of access where nobody could clearly trace who had shaped a decision. Succession simply meant the transfer of the crown and royal responsibility from one monarch to the next. Charles knew his son was not asking for cruelty. He was asking for clarity. And that made the choice even harder, because the king could see the logic without escaping the emotional cost. Charles finally approved the new arrangement, but he rejected harsher wording that would have formally excluded Camilla from certain family consultations. The monarch wanted boundaries, not humiliation. According to the dramatized internal account, he then instructed advisors to tell William that the decision had come from the king alone. Charles refused to let palace officials use his son as political cover for a choice only the sovereign could authorize. Camilla did not yet know how carefully he had tried to protect her. The queen would soon learn that the gentler language changed little about the practical result. By the following morning, members of her household began receiving revised instructions about access, consultation, and who would now handle sensitive family matters. What had sounded like a private compromise on paper became brutally real when the first doors inside the palace machinery began closing. The true weight of a royal decision is rarely felt when the document is signed. It is felt the next morning, when routines change. Calls stop arriving. Meetings disappear from diaries. People who once asked for guidance suddenly wait for someone else's approval. For Camilla, the Balmoral decision became real through silence. Nothing dramatic was announced, yet the pattern was unmistakable. Influence that had once moved naturally through private relationships was being redirected, and she could feel the difference almost immediately. Camilla noticed the first change in something almost painfully ordinary. A briefing that had previously appeared in her diary was gone. The queen consort asked her private secretary whether it had simply been moved, but the answer was harder to absorb. The discussion would now take place directly between Charles's and William's teams. Succession planning, meaning preparation for the future transfer of royal responsibility, would increasingly be handled through those clearly defined channels, along with sensitive family strategy and decisions affecting the prince's future role. Camilla understood the contradiction immediately. Publicly, her position remained untouched. She still carried out engagements, stood beside Charles, and retained the dignity of her place within royal life. Privately, however, the boundaries were becoming impossible to miss. She remained composed in front of staff, refusing to show humiliation, but later sat alone with the closed diary before her. The message was quiet but brutal. She was being asked to step back without ever looking as though she had been pushed. Charles came to her privately because he knew silence would only deepen the wound. The king explained that the new system was meant to protect both the crown and Camilla from future accusations of overreach. The crown, in this context, meant the institution of the monarchy and the authority attached to the sovereign, rather than simply the physical crown itself. She listened, then answered with painful calm. Protection, she told him, could feel remarkably similar to exclusion. Camilla's frustration grew when she learned her staff would also face new restrictions. Certain communications involving William could no longer be initiated freely and would need coordination through Charles's office first. The Queen heard the rule as another locked door. Yet the king then revealed something she had not known. Advisors had recommended going further, including language that could have isolated her from additional family consultations, and he had refused it. Charles wanted her to understand the difference. He had accepted boundaries, but he had not accepted humiliation. The monarch had fought to keep her involved, where he believed her experience and relationship with him still mattered. Camilla began to see that the decision had not been a simple choice between William and herself. Charles had been trying, however imperfectly, to hold together two loyalties that were pulling in opposite directions. For the first time since Balmoral, Camilla stopped asking what had been taken from her and began asking why Charles had fought to preserve what remained. The turning point did not happen around a council table. It happened when the machinery of monarchy was finally removed from the room. Charles and Camilla sat together without aides, folders, advisors, or anyone waiting to interpret their words. For days they had spoken around the decision. Now they spoke about what it had done to them. She wanted to know whether he still trusted her. He wanted her to understand why being king sometimes required him to disappoint the person closest to him. Charles arranged the conversation because administrative explanations had failed. The king understood that no briefing could repair what secrecy had damaged between them. Camilla entered believing the deepest issue was trust, while he saw the changes as preparation for responsibility, moving more clearly toward William. That transfer mattered because the future monarch would eventually inherit not only the crown, but the burden of decisions shaped long before his reign actually began. The queen understood that logic, but logic had not protected her from feeling pushed aside. Camilla asked the question she had been carrying since Balmoral. Had Charles believed she crossed a line? The king answered carefully. He said the problem was not one person, but a system that had become too dependent on personalities, private access, and relationships that were difficult for others to follow. He then did something she had not expected. He placed responsibility on himself. If boundaries had become unclear, he said, the failure ultimately belonged to the monarch, who had allowed them to remain unclear. Camilla felt some of her anger weaken. The queen admitted that being sidelined had frightened her, because acceptance within royal life had never felt completely secure. Years of criticism had taught her how quickly public approval could change, and private exclusion felt like the beginning of another judgment. Charles listened without defending himself. The king admitted he should have warned her before the Balmoral review reached its final stage. By keeping the process quiet, he had allowed structural reform to feel like personal betrayal. Charles then revealed another detail during their private conversation. The monarch said he had deliberately rejected proposals that would have reduced Camilla's ceremonial and charitable involvement. Ceremonial duties simply meant the public royal appearances and formal responsibilities connected to the institution. He wanted the private administrative dispute separated from her public role, because he did not believe one should destroy the other. Camilla finally made her choice. She would accept the revised boundaries rather than fight them, but she asked Charles for one promise. Any future change involving her must be discussed with her before advisors turned it into policy. The king agreed. For the first time since the review began, neither of them was trying to win. Their private agreement brought fragile calm back into the family. But the silence surrounding Balmoral had already begun to crack, and once the details escaped beyond royal walls, neither Charles nor Camilla would control how the story was told. Inside Balmoral, the conflict had finally cooled. Beyond its gates, the story was only beginning to explode. By the time the details escaped the palace, the private dispute had already begun healing. The public never saw that part first. Instead, Britain woke to dramatic headlines suggesting a royal power struggle had erupted behind Balmoral's stone walls. Television panels debated Camilla's standing. Commentators examined William's growing influence. Every phrase from the leaked account seemed to carry enormous meaning. Yet the loudest interpretation outside the palace was very different from the quieter truth Charles and Camilla had already reached privately. Camilla felt the full force of that difference over breakfast. A fictional morning newspaper carried a full-width image of Balmoral beneath the headline, "Winter Council Shock. Camilla's Palace Influence Curbed." The Queen read only part of the coverage before pushing it aside. Balmoral, the royal family's private Scottish residence, had suddenly become shorthand for a supposed power struggle. What hurt her most was not criticism itself. She had survived that before. It was watching a painful agreement between husband and wife turned into public humiliation. William disliked the story for another reason. The prince watched commentators describe him as the clear victor, as though the review had been a campaign to defeat Camilla rather than an attempt to clarify responsibility. He told an aide privately that he did not want the transition of royal authority framed as a personal war. For the future king, that transition meant the gradual movement of responsibility toward the next reign. Turning it into a family contest threatened the stability he had argued the review was meant to protect. Charles faced immediate pressure from palace communications staff. The king was advised that a detailed rebuttal might calm speculation, yet such a response could also confirm private operational details. A rebuttal, simply put, would be an official answer challenging the claims being circulated publicly. Charles rejected any statement that blamed advisors, diminished William, or portrayed Camilla as entirely uninvolved. He would not sacrifice one relationship to protect another from a bad headline. Camilla understood the cost of that silence, even if she did not enjoy it. The Queen knew some readers would assume the absence of a denial meant every dramatic interpretation was true. Charles still refused to feed the spectacle. William agreed with that choice, despite knowing it left him exposed to claims that he had deliberately pushed his father's wife aside. The palace therefore allowed the frenzy to burn itself out. No grand reversal followed. No public punishment appeared. The revised internal structure simply remained in place, quietly signaling that the core Balmoral decision had survived the headlines even as the family rejected the most dramatic interpretation of what it meant. When the headlines finally lost their heat, the real verdict could be seen not in newspapers, but in how Charles, Camilla, and William moved forward afterward. In the end, Balmoral did not destroy Camilla's position, nor did it produce the royal rupture outsiders imagined. What it did was more subtle, and perhaps more important. It marked the moment when personal influence gave way to clearer responsibility, when Charles accepted that protecting his wife did not require shielding every old arrangement, and when William learned that preparing to become king could not mean humiliating those already beside the throne. Everyone lost something. Everyone understood something. Camilla emerged from the crisis changed, but not erased. The Queen remained Charles's wife and a senior royal figure, while the internal structure around sensitive decisions became more clearly shared between the king and William. Institutional decision-making, in simple terms, meant the formal process through which responsibility was assigned, rather than allowing private relationships alone to shape outcomes. That distinction mattered because her dignity survived, even as some informal influence narrowed. William moved closer to the center, but the prince did not emerge as Camilla's conqueror. His responsibility grew because the monarchy was preparing for succession, meaning the eventual transfer of the crown and its duties to the next monarch. Weeks later, he joined Charles and the Queen for another routine family discussion. This time, the agenda was clear. Responsibilities were defined. Nobody entered wondering who had already been consulted or which private channel carried greater weight. Camilla accepted something she had resisted throughout Balmoral. Influence could change without dignity disappearing. The Queen still felt the sting of being excluded from areas where she once moved freely, yet she stopped treating every new boundary as rejection. Instead, she invested more deliberately in the duties that remained unquestionably hers, finding strength in work that could not be reduced to palace access or private influence. Charles learned a harsher lesson. The king understood that delaying difficult conversations had nearly caused more damage than the decision itself. He had tried to protect Camilla by keeping uncomfortable discussions away from her until the review was nearly complete. Instead, secrecy made reform feel like betrayal. His final realization was simple: loyalty inside a monarchy sometimes required honesty before protection. William also understood what the crisis demanded from him. The future king gained influence, but he refused to treat that gain as victory. Leadership required restraint. If institutional change became personal triumph, then reform would create wounds deeper than the confusion it was designed to solve. Balmoral therefore became more than the setting of one leaked dispute. It became the moment Charles, Camilla, and William finally separated affection from authority. No crown was removed, no marriage collapsed, no heir staged a triumph. Three people simply accepted that personal loyalty and royal responsibility could no longer compete for the same space. Balmoral began with a leak about Camilla's influence, but it ended with something far more lasting, a family finally recognizing that the crown could not move forward until everyone understood where love ended, where duty began, and how both could survive in the same room. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.